Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Identity Part 9, Abstraction. It's basically a continuation of the last conversation, but I want to focus on abstraction, which is sort of an abstract concept, so it becomes a bit paradoxical. But that's what I want to explore, and how our world being inundated with abstraction sort of crushes us if we're trying to form a sense of belonging, worth, and identity that's at the core of human well-being. Before I do that, I've got to remember, almost forgot again, the classes. There's one space left in June and 3 spaces left, I believe, in the early September class. The later September class is sold out. So 1 in June, 2 or 3 in September, the early September. So thanks to everybody who signed up, and thanks to everybody who listens, by the way. I really do appreciate it. It is encouraging. I like the comments, even the comments they disagree with me. That's great too. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. And abstraction. Here we go. So why is abstraction a problem? And what does it mean for us? And how do we know that we're sort of inundated by it? Well, I think it's pretty obvious we're inundated by it, but let's think of what this means. So there's a philosopher Singer who has this sort of, moderately famous within the philosophical world idea, and he calls it the story of the child and the pond, and it goes like this. And he says, okay, look, here's what's going on. You're walking through a park, and you've been through the park a lot of times, so you know the water in the pond is, don't say, waist deep. And usually the park is filled with people, but today there's no one really around. And you look in the pond, and you see this young child is drowning. And you're like, oh no, there's a child drowning in the pond. But that morning, you happen to wear your nicest shoes and your nice pants, and you're going to a meeting or something, and you're like, oh, but you're going to save the child, right? Almost certainly you're going to say, there's no risk to me. I can just, wade into the pond, save the child. Everything will be great. I need to take responsibility and just do this. And I'm really not going to worry about the pants and the shoes. I'm not going to say probably that, because of my nice shoes and my nice pants, I didn't put the child in the pond, so it's not my responsibility. I really have nothing to do with the child. And I don't want to waste the money that I spent on my shoes and my pants, so I'll just let him drown because it has nothing to do with me. Now, Singer goes on to say, well, therefore, you see that, well, certainly almost everybody's going to jump in the pond and save the child. By the way, statistically, this is true. This notion that bystanders don't help people has been proven demonstrably false. Like 90-some% of the very high 90s% of the time, people do crazy stuff to help people that they think are in trouble. So humans are a lot nicer than we're often given credit for. So certainly almost everybody, like 97% of people or something above that, would jump in and save the child. And he says, but here's the thing. He says, so why won't we take the same money that we're just going to spend on the pants and the shoes and send that off to child aid organizations to help children in poverty and need around the world? He says this is sort of, why don't we do this? We need to do this, right? It's the same idea, and it really doesn't make a difference that the child's in front of us or not. Now, of course, because it's abstraction, you can see the problems are going to come here, but I would like to point out that this analogy, or a little story, parable perhaps is the best word there, is based on, I would assume based on, I don't know that he knowingly did this, but anyway, there's a much better version of this in Mencius. And this is the story of the child at a well. And it says a stranger is walking through a town, doesn't know anybody, doesn't have anything to gain whatsoever, but he sees a child about to fall into a well and will just spontaneously grab the child and save it. No questions asked. And the point that Mencius makes is that people are fundamentally good. This is human nature. Most people, almost everybody, is fundamentally good. And if you nurture the goodness in them, they will do good things. And this is, by the way, one of the core concepts of Confucianism, which is why it has a different approach to identity than the Western tradition, which is very much suspicious of people or think we're all innately sinners and so on. So it's a very different approach to a concept of people at core. And like I mentioned, we will get around to discussing some of those differences later. So, but Mencius never goes on to this next level. He never says, Would you send money to save children from wells from other towns? It doesn't, he just says you would see it, you would do it. It's innate in us to do a helpful thing for a child. And Singer's argument is like, yeah, that should extend reasonably, that should extend to children in other places. The problem with this is simply everything. Everything about this is wrong. Again, go back to what we've been talking about. Our physical reality, what is faced with us, what we're deal with is concrete when you're facing a child in a pond. We're really very much better at dealing with that because that is our evolutionary and cultural history for a very, very long time. We were almost always immersed in concrete situations. In fact, for most of human history and prehistory, we would have known who the child was. We wouldn't be saving our strange child. We'd be saving an actual child that we knew because we never saw strangers or rarely saw strangers. It would be weird to see a stranger. And so not only would we save the child, we would be saving Sarah's child. We would know who that child was. We'd know how they related to us. Not that it was change our behavior, because we'd probably save a drowning strange child just as quickly. However, we just wouldn't encounter it. And so for, again, almost the entirety of our evolution, both culturally and then before that as our primate ancestors, we dealt with a world that was very concrete, physically palpable, appealing directly to our senses, about which we had an exceptionally visceral grasp. And then suddenly we're thrown in the modern world, and again in evolutionary and cultural terms, very suddenly, in which, well, we don't know how to respond to a child who's drowning someplace else in the world, because they're all the questions just stack up here. In fact, I think it's incredibly disingenuous to suggest that the analogy applies, because the first question, of course, is, well, who should I send the money to? I'm not suggesting that any aid organization has ever misspent money in the history of mankind, but yeah, it's it's tricky. What's the best way to help children? Right? How should we spend the money? So for lots of child poverty is caused by war. So perhaps we should take our money, arm some factions, and send in there, kill the people who are creating problems for the children. Is that what we should do with our money? Because it would probably be effective if we had enough money. We could just kill the problem people and sort of help save the children. But it's like, no, we don't want to do that, right? That's no good. The UN does this sort of thing, and it turns out it's really, really unbelievably complicated to try and solve large-scale social issues outside. I mean, it's hard enough to deal with stuff in your own country, much less in other countries about which you know nothing, their histories. And so instead you have to trust an intermediary whom you don't really know. You might know something about them, you do your research, but you don't know them viscerally again. So again, you have this stranger problem. They seem like nice people. They seem like they aren't going to embezzle the money and buy a jet or go to Vegas with some, hookers and blow and have a nice time with it. But no, they're probably going to try and help. But even if they try and help, we know that often even very well-intentioned attempts to help relieve poverty or deal with issues of inequality and run into trouble. That sometimes they don't help, sometimes they exacerbate situations. I mean, this is the history of international relations and aid and all these struggles to try and do good that sometimes, not invariably, but sometimes turn out not good at all. And so there's all these layers of doubt that get sown between an individual and abstract. But we tend to pretend, and this is where we're getting back to our subject of identity, we tend to pretend like these abstractions don't really matter. They're not that different. They're just, we have the concept, we have the idea. No, the difference between the visceral, what appeals to your senses, and some concept that somewhere, someplace in a country I don't know, there are people I don't know who are going to help children I don't know in a way I don't understand. Right? The worlds apart. I see child, I see pond, I know pond, I get child. Not confusing, not hard, not troubling. The other is trouble. There's problems, there's psychic tension at every level because it's not visceral. That's exactly the problem. The whole point of his story actually highlights the problem. It doesn't explain it or give some sort of analogy of what's going to happen or how we should behave. And that is their central issue. We really do not, I think, have come to terms in any way with the dangers of abstraction, which is weird for someone who spends a lot of their life reading books and talking about philosophy, but it really is a morass, a danger in abstractions. And we're immersed in them. So first, I want to make a distinction. And by the way, this is of course arguable. I could argue, this is simply part of this is just phenomenology. I'm just going to knock off the entire field of phenomenology in just a few sentences. So don't worry about that. But I think a helpful way to think of it is, again, appeals directly to your senses. And again, we don't have 5 senses, by the way. We have lots of senses. No one can exactly agree on how many, but sometimes you feel hungry. That's a sense. You can feel hot and cold. Those are senses. We have a sense of our location in 3-dimensional space, by the way. This is why our primate ancestors, chimpanzees, lots of them patrolled territory. And you have to have a notion, again, which we mentioned in an earlier lecture, you have to have a sense of space in your mind and then where you are in that space. But it's the in your mind that's really important, because as you go through, for instance, your house or your apartment, you know where everything is. If you've been there for a while, you learn the pattern. But of course, if you move a chair the next day, what do? You kick the chair with your foot because you've disrupted that, right? Now you go, oh, that's right, I got to relearn that pattern. I've got to get my mental map of my space in line with my physical actual space. And so I'm not saying it's just the immediate concrete, but it is this strongly reinforced, sensible world which you can interact with directly and whose patterns you have built familiarity with. If you're not familiar with something, then it really isn't that concrete to your senses. So there's layers to this. Again, it's a gross oversimplification, but this notion of being able to encounter things and say, okay, my senses feel it. This is visceral. This I know. This has a certain concrete element to it. So the opposite of that is the abstraction. Those things that appeal with increasingly remoteness only to intellectual concepts, to mental constructs. And we're just so inundated with this that we forget that there is even a distinction sometimes. Like, this is what Singer's problem is, as if this is the same. It's not the same in any way. The visceral, the real, really does matter. And where do we see this? Well, language. Let's take a moment and talk about language. Language is an abstraction. It's both amazing and wonderful and crazy and completely misleading. Language often misleads as much as it helps. So one way to ponder this, again, thinking about our evolutionary process and our cultural processes, when we don't see a lot of strangers and we don't travel and things don't change, let's say we have a word for something, basic, bread. Maybe we're in a culture that eats bread. Or if you're in China, you have a word for rice, right? Or you have a word for sorghum. They grow a lot of sorghum. You have these sorts of concepts. Once you know the word rice and you've eaten rice, you know when somebody says rice, you know what they mean. The opportunities for confusion are very low because we both can point to the same thing. Like, I eat rice, you eat rice, we've eaten rice every day together. That word means something to us, and it means something very concrete. So even if we're out walking someplace where there is no rice, we're on the hillside gathering herbs or looking for the Zen master who's always disappeared into the fog, or the Taoist monk who's out there someplace, we can say, wow, I'm hungry, I would really like some rice. And so even though there's no rice around, we know what this means because we both have this experience. So it's so that language can work that way. But of course, we've left that far in the dust. Much of what we talk about, much of the way we use language, is abstractions relating to abstractions relating to abstractions. Now, part of this is the beauty of the human mind and the ability to create, but it baffles us because we start saying things like, oh, rescue kid pond, drowning child pond. Probably we all know what a pond is. We all know what children are. We know what drowning is, unless we're from a desert culture. We never encountered that. But most people will be good. We have those words. We know what they mean. Reducing poverty, See how that's very different? We have no visceral sense. We don't know what poverty actually means. And again, don't believe me. Just talk to the people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have no idea how to define poverty, and they just say it very straightforwardly, and they say we've got all these different measures, and we don't know if any of them are any good. And the people in economics and social sciences debate about this endlessly because it's tricky. Because what? Because we know that people suffer from lack and want, and that's bad. So it's okay with that. But what, it's such a complex world. How do you get your fingers around what poverty means, and what does it mean to, of course, reduce it? See how tricky this is? Because what's less? Is poverty a countable thing? So you can have 75% less, or is it a phase change, right? Is it a state, right? Where you go from liquid water to steam, or from liquid water to ice. You've actually changed state. You don't get less water. You don't reduce water. You change its state. And so is it even correct to say reduce poverty? Shouldn't we really say take somebody, and which we do say actually, take them out of poverty, like change their phase? And or are we taking someone's poverty and declining it by 15%? See, we don't know. So reducing poverty sounds good, except for we don't know what we're reducing, and it's not clear what poverty is. Those two things are abstract. Child drowning, not abstract. We can viscerally feel this. People who are lacking certain things, they know this. They aren't confused. It's not confusing to them often, right? They've got this track down. And so you can say, oh, we don't want to reduce poverty. We want to give that person the opportunity to have water, right? They don't have fresh water. That's bad. Let's get them water. That's very concrete. So we know water, like understand, let's give them water or provide them water. At least that's clearer than reduce poverty. So, those levels of abstraction, and of course, that's just the beginning. The language just goes on and on. We use language so loosely, and we rely on the abstraction to create confusion rather than create meaning and to help. So, another example I like to use, I think I've used before in my lecture on health, is nobody wants insurance. We do not want insurance. We don't care about insurance. What we want is for, if I break my arm, I can go to the hospital, get it fixed, miracles of modern medicine, and not go bankrupt. That's what I want. And people go, oh yeah, we call that insurance. Of course we know this is not true. If you have insurance, but you have the wrong kind of insurance and you go to the wrong hospital, then instead of the insurance company paying for it or paying for much of it, they'll say, oh, well, you're out of our network or something, and so we'll only pay 20% instead of 7%, all these. So it turns out that you can have insurance, this sort of abstract, conceptual, legal construct, but you don't get what you actually want, which is, I've got a growth, I need to have it removed. Well, sorry, we don't do that. We don't cover that. You got the wrong hospital, you have the wrong doctor, you have the wrong kind of illness, which I always love. That's the kind of illness we don't like, so we're not going to, cover that or whatever. So, but again, everyone's like, oh, well, we want insurance. People want insurance. It's like, no, we don't. People don't want insurance. In fact, we really don't want insurance because it's complicated and confusing and involves paperwork, and nobody wants that. Who wants that? I don't want that. What we want is to just walk in the hospital and be better and then walk out, right? This is the ideal situation. Tricky. I'm not saying this is a simple fix. I'm just saying we get confused by the concept of insurance, which we go, oh, well, if I have insurance, then all these problems go away, versus the actual reality of insurance, which we all know, particularly in the United States, by the way. If you're in other countries where you've sort of done a better job of sorting this, good on you. In the United States, we're not making much headway on this one. It's just this huge morass. Who didn't pay? When did they pay? What date did you come? See, that's not what we want. We want to go to the hospital and be better. Not confusing, very visceral, very concrete, very easy to understand. Insurance. But what do we talk about? What's the political discourse? What's the cultural discourse? Oh, insurance, as if insurance will solve the problem. It does not solve the problem. In fact, it may make the problem much worse. And yet, here we are. We're in these endless cycles where we play word games because we don't think in concrete, visceral applications. If you can get in the habit of that, then it's often very helpful to clarify what's going on around you, because you realize, oh, word game, word game, word game. We're not talking about anything. We're just, we're putting an abstraction next to an abstraction and saying, look at these two abstractions. Okay, well, it can be interesting. And again, don't want to criticize love language. Don't want to criticize, higher order thinking, one of humanity's great achievements. But in a world where so much of our visceral experience has been denatured, been taken from us, and replaced by all of these abstractions, now it becomes increasingly problematic and unnerving. We'll talk about that. Another big abstraction, of course, perhaps the most popular abstraction besides language would be money. We forget that money is an abstraction. This is back to Singer's example. It's really the perfect negative example, because ruining your shoes and pants is very concrete. Doesn't bother us. We're going to jump in that pond to save the kid. If I got new high heel shoes or leather loafers, a new dress, or whatever, we're not going to think about that. And again, studies show this is true. We don't. We just jump in and save people. We're good like that. But money is not the same as saving a drowning child. Like the notion that you can substitute $600 or some whatever your shoes are worth and send that off in the mail, and that's the same as rescuing a child, it's nothing. It has zero correlation. What I've done is I've started the chain of abstraction. Oh, I have this abstraction, money, which could or could not do something, that I'm now going to send to an abstraction, some organization that's going to address an abstraction, poverty, in a country that I'm not familiar with. Maybe they're going to go someplace I've never been. I don't know anybody there. So I have an abstract concept of a geographic location filled with abstract people who are not abstract to them, of course, but they're abstract to us. We don't know them. I'm abstract to everybody else, right? It's just this, we can only know a very small number of people again. And so we live in this world, of course, money, very popular all over the place. And we continually forget that money is this just crazy abstraction. I was talking to one of my friends, and he said, yeah, people always act as if whatever your currency is will be around forever, even though we know factually that will never happen. The dollar's going to go away. The German mark went away. Then you get the euro. The euro will go away at some point. Like, the history of the world is littered with dead currency. The idea of money tends to stay popular, but the money itself, it just comes and goes, right? It just appears, circulates for a while, then it vanishes, doesn't circulate anymore. There's any number of reasons. But we treat it as if this is this permanent, forever, never going to go away, absolute perfect asset that is real. Now it functions, it does stuff, but it is an abstraction. It's a weird abstraction. And so we get attached to it because we forget that it's an abstraction rather than something concrete. And they always say, if you were hungry, if you're starving to death, a sandwich that you would have paid $5 for now is probably worth $5,000 or $5 million. Or you'll give all your money not to starve to death for that food. The food becomes very much more concrete, right? Because we need that to live. But the value of the money becomes hugely variable because it's theoretically at some point attached back to the real world, of course, so tangentially as to be almost ridiculous, which is kind of what we're experiencing in the world today because of this huge international economic disruption of the pandemic, with billions of people having their lives disoriented, their work habits fractured, and somehow the world economy seems to just roll along as if it's not connected to anything. And then something connects and it blows up. Suez Canal is a perfect example. Economic world trade, global shipping, all sounds very abstract, and it is, and it's almost always talked in really abstract terms. But it turns out that somewhere an actual concrete ship is going through an actual canal, and if that canal gets blocked, all of our smooth functioning just went right down the tubes, right? And so all of a sudden, the entire global shipping system gets jammed up because, hey, it's got to go through a canal. Now we can't go through the canal, so trouble, because the world is real at some point, right? There's these concrete elements to it that we forget about, because we're in love with abstraction. And again, money, just the the craziest one. And a third one, of course, we can go on and on. There's so many of them that I think now is will articulate, hopefully, if I can articulate it, I think it's a clear example that I'll probably mess up, but if I can articulate it clearly, is this concept of fame, which has become increasingly popular in the modern world. And everybody's like, oh, why is fame all of a sudden a thing? Why is it, we used to be sort of lean more towards privacy, and now all of a sudden we're leaning more towards a fame culture, a culture that seeks notoriety and public recognition. But notice fame, again, is an abstraction. I mean, it has real world elements to it, but it's the notion of going, oh, again, for my identity, I need people to feed back to me a sense that I exist and I belong and I'm important and that they know who I am. Remember, I mentioned this last time, loneliness is very much more, it's much worse for your health than smoking and drinking heavily, not just a little bit, but like a lot. So it's like, wow, that's impressive. So one response to this, when you're surrounded by strangers, who again, these are not people you're surrounded by when you don't know them. I mean, they're there, they're real, they're visceral, but you have to interact with them in abstraction, which is weird and disorienting in itself, because you can't actually treat them as people because usually there's too many of them and you don't know any of them. What this means is you're also not getting the feedback that you need to feel good about yourself. So a perfectly reasonable attempt to address this problem of the modern world is to say, oh, I want people to recognize me. I want to be places and I want to be seen as someone who is known and recognized. And these images of the famous people, right, of, the cameras flash and they smile, that you see repeated over and over and over and over again, is so alluring, because if you're disoriented, if you do not feel like you're getting the feedback that allows you to feel like you exist, then like, oh, look, that person is getting the feedback. They're getting positive reinforcement for their existence. They're getting their identity, their self is being acknowledged. The trap here, of course, which is what everybody who becomes famous, not everybody, but many people who've become famous and then discovered, this doesn't function that well, because this is abstract knowing. They don't really know you. And then people who become famous talk about this, that there's this increasing gap between like, oh, well, you know some very small aspect of me, but you think that's all of me. And so actually I feel like I'm being alienated even from what was perhaps part of me. And then if you become reliant on that, then you need strangers, abstraction again, this distance, they aren't personal with you, to continually provide you feedback that actually increases your alienation. And so, basically all, it's a consistent drumbeat of talking about how bad social media is for people, causes all kinds of stress and anxiety and, a lot of, I don't know, I've not seen any convincing numbers that more people commit suicide because of this, but the evidence is growing. This may be the case, but let's hold off on figuring out if that's true. These things take a while to disambiguate from all of the craziness of our world. But it would make sense if this does become true, because on one hand, it can give you that sense of communication, that sense of participating in a community. On the other hand, it's still very, very abstract and remote. And if it doesn't give you a sense of reality, if it doesn't give you that visceral, vicarious sense in your body that, oh, this works, then at some point it's self-alienating, right? It makes the process or the problem of feeling isolated and alone even worse, because now you're getting feedback that is not helping you but actively harming you. And this is why something like fame, this abstract people, oh, I want to be famous. And it's like, why? I want people to know me. But you want people you don't know to know you, which is weird. Why would you want people you don't know to know you? Right? Why is that functional? It's like, well, in a world with a lot of people, how do you meet new people? How do you experience new ideas? So it's not crazy. But you can see where as it gets extended, it's like, oh, but if I don't have anything else, then I have to have strangers continually reinforce a sense of who I am. And so now am I playing to the strangers, or am I playing to myself? And so that, those struggles. And so it basically says, here's a problem to help me solve identity issues. And what it does is it sort of amplifies them and puts a magnifier on them and says, well, is this really your identity? Which is not helpful if you're having identity issues, right? You can see this. And so as we wade through this ocean of abstraction, I mean, just completely weighing us down, then you want to think about the reverse, right? Is to say, how do I de-abstract my life? If you're interested in this kind of thing, that's an unbelievably, I would argue, important question in the modern world. What can I do that makes me feel less abstract? How can I limit or increase or whatever ways to increase my visceral, sensual engagement with the world? And there's lots of ways to ponder this and approaches, and I'll leave it up to you. But it's not that difficult to think about, except for it sounds so silly. But you go, okay, what do I do that engages my visceral senses? The more you do that, the more you'll feel engaged, and the more you'll feel you because you're actually feeling you. And this is not really a big psychological breakthrough or anything. It's like, look, we're physical beings and living in a society that tries to convince us that we're brains in jars. We're not brains in jars. We're monkeys who have the capacity to do some abstract thinking, which is great and wonderful and amazing, but let's not get too confused about the fact that we're still primates. We're sort of, I can never decide if we're primates gone big time or primates gone big time wrong. I'm always debating that. Which way did we go? But we're just sort of primates with some pretty impressive abilities to think that we just won't ever use. So how can I increase this? So if you think of anything that we think we might want and go, okay, I want, I'm trying to think what's a good, right? Oh, health, right? We want health. We want to be healthy. I mean, yes, pro health. Let's do that. All right. What does that mean concretely? How can I make that visceral, what health means? Okay. And again, of course, health is sort of an abstract concept. I want to feel good. What makes me feel good, right? Does fresh air and probably exercise a little bit of some kind, walking, strolling about, whatever you enjoy doing. What kind of physical activities do you enjoy? Do those. Now notice, if you're doing physical activities you enjoy, well, you're experiencing joy, which is plenty good end in itself, and you're probably making yourself feel better, which is another plenty good end in itself. And it's visceral because you're actually using your body, however that is. Dancing, basketball, tennis, who cares? Walking about, strolling about aimlessly. It's all fine. It's all equally good if it brings you joy and makes you feel more grounded and viscerally attached to the world. Unfortunately, what we tend to do is the reverse, which is we tend to go, okay, I need a plan. God damn it. Just the whole notion just makes my skin crawl. Because okay, now the plan is what becomes important. Not opposed to planning, but notice the plan is that first small level of abstraction. And then people go, oh, now I want the best possible plan, right? If I don't want just a plan to say, oh, I should walk a little more. I'll schedule some time to walk about. Okay, great, wonderful. We have a quote unquote plan. No. Now I need a maximizing plan. And so all of a sudden, people become obsessed with these incredibly complex, plans to make. It's like, yeah. See, so what you're loving is this abstract concept that if I fulfill all of these time schedules and goals and number of push-ups and miles run or whatever, stretches and meditation, then I'll be someplace. And it's like, no, then you'll be fulfilling this thing that you dreamed up that is in fact an abstraction. I'm not saying it's a terrible idea, but you just don't, again, it's so easy to get confused between what's actually happening, giving you joy, making you feel good, and a schedule. So people will schedule these, I want to do all this workout. And then when they miss a workout, they feel bad. And so the abstract concept of a plan, which they are now meeting, has subverted the entire process because now they feel bad about themselves, because when the whole point was to make them feel good. And so The abstraction itself often becomes the barrier to the concrete visceral good. And we do, and then, we do this in education. I mean, when people are, students aren't making progress towards their degree, they're like, oh, they're doing poorly. It's like, really? It's like speed is the thing. How fast you get your education is the most important aspect, apparently. No, of course not. That's absurd. Like, A, it assumes that there's a day you finish being educated, which I hope is not true. And B, that's like, sometimes you go, well, just take a break. Take a quarter off, take a semester off, take a year off, take 5 years off. Who the hell cares? Right? And then come back and make some more quote unquote progress towards your degree. Yeah, but no, the plan, the ideals, the abstractions continuously overwhelm us. And so again, constantly ask yourself, or at least constantly, that's probably too strong, but start looking for ways or opportunities or moments where you go, oh, am I confusing the abstract concepts, like, say money or a concept from language, for the visceral thing itself? And the best way to test this is, what is the visceral element? What part of this can I pick up? What part of this can I throw a rock at? What part of this can I hug or eat? And then work from there. The more you work from there, I think the better off you tend to be. And part of this, if you've ever done hiking or gone in the woods, one of the things I think makes the experience often quite powerful and moving for people is the woods are very concrete, but not human. They just don't care. They're not sending a lot of signals to us. So the built world, the world we inhabit most of the time, architecture, billboards, media, digital media, is all constructed towards our consumption. It's always telling us something, encouraging us something, discouraging us from something. It's filled with messages, subtle, unsubtle, and often abstract concepts pouring in on us that we're just deciphering constantly. This is what we do. And again, not necessarily bad, but it's part of how we have to interact with a world that's so filled with built environments that are products of human imagination, either amazing or terrible. And we code and decode and code and decode, just always working on this subconsciously and consciously. And then we wander off into an environment that really doesn't have any messages for us. Just doesn't care, totally indifferent to us. I mean, maybe there's a trail that sends a message. Maybe someone's built a bridge that's helpful, that gives us a little knowledge. But basically, the rocks don't care. The trees don't care. The river doesn't care. The clouds don't care. They're indifferent to us. So they're visceral and real, and they don't carry nearly the level of code. Now, we bring code to them. Oh, trees are beautiful. We love them. Or, it's not that we don't arrive with narratives that we plant on them, but they tend not to send that much back to you. And so I think part of the feeling that we often get when we're out hiking about or wandering about in more natural environments is a sense of freedom, of all of this slowly going away. Like, oh yeah, there is nothing here for me. There's no message here for me. There's no like overwhelming human code. There's nothing to decipher or decode. Until you get to Taoism, which then says, yeah, that's right. So get rid of all that human stuff and then learn to be a rock, right? And that's sort of that next level. And again, why the Chinese tradition is very different, which we'll discuss. Also the Indian tradition. But those moments when we can release ourselves from feeling the overwhelming sense of abstraction and disconnection by doing things that are palpable and physical and visceral, help ground our sense of ourselves, because those senses are absolutely necessary to us, 100%. And again, because I'm always obsessed with education, one of the things we know, and all the studies show this convincingly, is the more physical interaction you have with a concept, the better you are able to learn it and remember it and utilize it. So if you are taking notes, handwriting notes on paper is very much better for you than like typing it on a computer or just trying to remember it and staring out the window. Highlighting in books as you read, bending pages, all of that is very much more helpful for learning than reading stuff on a screen that doesn't give you that kind of visceral feedback. You can't feel the paper, you can't bend it, you spill your coffee on the page. You remember this, often subconsciously, but it helps the material stick in your mind. And so one of the things that's been happening as education has been increasingly digitalized is it's become more abstract and people struggle. It just makes it harder. It doesn't help. It makes it worse. It makes it more difficult because you're losing the visceral feedback. You're losing the opportunities to go, oh, I wrote that down. I remember that. That's right, because you wrote it down. That's what helps you remember it. You don't need to reread the notes. Maybe rereading them helps you, but mostly just writing them down will help you the most. So if you learn languages, they say make your own flashcards. You can buy big sets of flashcards, which is convenient. Notice again, you take money to buy the work that you should have done to help you learn the language without doing the work that would actually help you learn the language, right? So you've confused the money to helping you with what you theoretically are trying to accomplish, learn a language. See how quickly we go wrong again? Oh, it's the flashcards that matter. Turns out that making the flashcards is a big part of the flashcards because that writing them and then seeing them will help trigger your memory, specifically seeing them in your handwriting, because you'll remember that particular bizarre, particularly with my handwriting, which is horrible. You'll see that, oh, I know that word because I remember writing it's very visually cueing to me because I wrote it. Somebody else probably couldn't read it. So, and you would do the same thing with your own handwriting. And so that process, the physical process, reinforces it, makes it visceral, makes it real. But of course, the best way to learn a language is go to a country and live there for a while. It takes about 6 months. I'm assuming you don't just speak English to everybody. You'll be good. You'll be fine. You'll be able to order a cappuccino. What else do you need to be able to do? Right? You'll be able to get through your day. You'll be picking it up and you'll learn it furiously. Why? Because it's everywhere. It's visceral. It's everyday life. Everything you do, you need some of that language. And boy, you want it. And so you get it. It's in no way confusing. It's just straightforward. But the more abstract you make it, the more distant, the less visceral. Sitting in a classroom with flashcards that somebody else created for you that you have no association with, that you flipped through once or twice because you were like thinking there might be a test. Nah, this is not a good way to learn it, because notice you're trying to take a test so that you can get a grade that you're moving on towards some other goal. So you have abstraction, 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 which is very different from like, man, I'm hungry. I want to find some good place to eat. Whew. Let me focus in on the 12 words I know and see if I can turn those into a nice sandwich because I'm hungry. Ooh, that's a concrete, visceral goal. And when you solve it, you feel good. I have an accomplishment. Look, I got a sandwich. I didn't get a grade that may or may not reflect anything about the work I did. I got a sandwich that I can eat, or I got a cappuccino I can drink, or I was able to meet some people, and that's very exciting, or whatever. That the visceral, the concrete matters. And so looking for those opportunities, because again, so often in the modern world, we tend to shy away from that, and we want to move towards, we tend to embrace the abstract, which we're already overwhelmed with, as a means of dealing with a problem that is created by the abstract. So it just sort of, again, it ramifies, it becomes increasingly bad for us. So I'll just exit. And by the way, you can clearly see that the two are sort of, linked. I kind of think of this as 8A and 8B, but this being growing leery of and looking for opportunities to avoid abstraction and to embrace the concrete is hugely, or often, not invariably of course, but often hugely, hugely clarifying. It gives you a sense of like, oh, I know this. Not that it's a true capital ontological sense of true, but it's like, oh, now I have this experience. I've had this moment. I've had this feeling. I know how much it weighs. I know what it tastes like. Now you know. Now you're there. Now you have that sense of feedback from the world and from yourself that allows you to feel more grounded and to begin to develop a stronger sense of identity. Thank you.